Is there anyone? I think the discussion we had earlier, Mr. Ray, Mr. Grindstaff, on categorizing the BDCP-related issues, just rethink it through on this and go from there. Are there people who want to talk on this section, water supply reliability? Not as if we haven't covered most of the same things before. Okay, last section for our consideration, then we're out of here by noon, is the section entitled Recommendations for Research and Monitoring, and 1 potentially consistent, 1 consider in the Delta Science Plan, and 3 consistent. Mr. Ray.
Yeah.
And by the way, could you, because this is the last, we'll tend to give it less attention than it deserves as a subject area, in a kind of boring focus on research and monitoring. But my experience has been we always go for the grand gesture political speech, and then for decades lament we don't do research, don't do monitoring, and refuse to change our behaviors.
Well, I think that the great unknown in this actually is the suggestion to conduct a comprehensive and credible benefit cost analysis of Delta alternatives. What led me to and our staff to indicate that might potentially be consistent would be to understand what's the extent of that analysis that would be required, what kinds of projects might that be applied to. Certainly every covered action that might come before a local government or another public agency to require that have a comprehensive benefit cost evaluation would be a substantial new imposition. And the kinds of situations in which that might be desirable, I think we need to understand more clearly. New recreation data would certainly provide a useful performance measure of the implementation of those sorts of actions. Same with the economic sustainability scorecard, and the science program is certainly interested in engineering and economic studies in addition to the ecological work that's been some of their meat and potatoes over the last years.
For anyone who's watching this at home or at their office who might not have spent their life learning about the statute that was passed in 2009, would you explain what the Delta Science Plan is?
Well, you probably know better than I, but my understanding is that we're going to be preparing a Delta Science Plan over the coming year,
yep.
And that would be one of the places where those sorts of initiatives ought to be outlined.
Yeah, and let's see, I'm trying to remember. There is in fact language on that in this. It's a complicated process, and it's more than just reflecting on this. Joe?
I actually want to add one other thing. In the third draft Delta Plan, we included a requirement for comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. And there were howls of complaint from all kinds of parties, largely from local agencies who said, you can't impose this requirement on us. This is burdensome and not something that we should do. And so after much complaining, the council directed staff to simplify
and now there is an epiphany. A burning bush in the desert has been discovered. The complaints from local governments have been reversed. And
so when we look at these things, we have to be really careful. If we in fact require that, are we imposing a requirement that may cause more problems than it helps? And so that's, and I'm serious. The reason we took it out was not just because lots of people yelled, but because we realized when people do projects, inevitably they're going to think about what are the costs, and is the council going to attempt to substitute its judgment for the project proponents when they're moving forward. And in some cases, so we had a lot of discussion and controversy about it at that time.
And certainly some kinds of projects, ecosystem restoration projects, are a good example. Benefit cost evaluations are not useful tools. Really, you want to be looking at cost effectiveness evaluations and value engineering approaches. But the benefit cost evaluation in that situation isn't really relevant. That's why the Water Resources Council's guidelines don't require benefit cost.
Although, as somebody was telling me yesterday, according to Jerry Merrill, ecosystem restoration is priceless.
And therefore it had $18 signs behind it. And yes,
I'll just make two comments on this. Yeah. One, actually, to return to the recreation data question, that it's really important. I mean, we really struggled in this study with this, and I think others have as well with the existing data, and we think we did the very best we can. But as you go forward and think about revising this plan, I think this is something that's really important. Not just new baseline data, but studies that have some of these management questions in mind in the study design on the recreation side. On the benefit cost analysis, you don't want to do benefit cost analysis for projects that cost $900. You might put a limit on it, but we're talking about $1 billion expenditures here on some of these projects, and I think it's a reasonable expectation of both applying the best available science, which benefit cost analysis is, as well as the stewardship
Should we have applied that to the connector freeway between 99 and I-5 in downtown Stockton?
I would, yeah. I mean,
if we were starting over again.
Yeah.
I was Don and I were smiling. The question on this one is, do I want a cost-benefit analysis for all projects or just ones I don't like? And the answer most people come down with is just ones I don't like, but don't want to say it. The problem, this is Joe's point, once you start, you are inherently developing a standard that everyone will be required to follow on any project of whatever significance. The expansion of the economics department at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, for example.
Well, our rules only cover.
Then be very specific. I think that there are certain projects within here which are very large, are being considered within these plans that demand a benefit cost analysis. So let's be very specific about that.
Who would expect anything else of an economist?
Right. My recommendation would be that the isolated conveyance proposals and some of the largest habitat proposals that are extremely costly to implement, in some cases, for instance, the 65,000 acre tidal habitat proposal in the BDC proposal has a price tag of almost $2 billion of taxpayer funds. And I think it's a reasonable question to look at the effectiveness of that, as well as for the isolated conveyance, that doing a financial feasibility analysis for the beneficiaries of that is not the same as evaluating all the social benefits and costs of that.
So on the habitat one, would it be evaluating whether a given proposal or set of proposals would achieve the goal compared to doing something else or not doing something?
Well,
is that what you mean?
You might want to go away from a benefit cost framework into a cost effectiveness framework or something, as Dan was suggesting, and saying, what are our most cost effective ways of reaching some goals. I think that might be an effective way to go. But I think that some economic analysis to the habitat strategies is
But like on the 65,000, you said $2 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you said it in a way that implies you think that might be too expensive.
It may not be. I was just saying that it's a substantial expenditure of public funds.
But you got to consider, what if you were to take and say, what's the impact of taking 165,000 acres of farmland that depends upon exports from the Delta out of production, and what's that cost comparison to what you would have in the Delta, also in terms of effectiveness?
But let's. Oh, I'm sorry.
I wanted to stick with the one on the habitat. So.
But just that would have a similar impact. I mean, you could look at that as either offsetting or complementary.
What I mean is, so you project a cost to do this environmental project, then what the benefit presumably is that the habitat is successful at generating increased numbers of species that would depend on it, right?
Correct.
Okay. In other words, the goal isn't just doing the habitat project. It's the habitat in pursuit of habitat for wildlife, presumably, right? Okay. So do you mean, because you're doing this in advance, it's whether or not it's going to succeed at that, or whether there's some less expensive way to achieve it, or that the goal isn't worthy because the cost is high? Which of those would you be
I mean, those are all
trying to measure?
No, those are all different ways of looking at it. In the case of habit, I mean, you're talking about so many potential projects, and they don't all have the same goals. I just think that it would be useful to look at the comparative costs and environmental benefits.
Compared to what, though? That's what I'm trying to figure out. What you're measuring compared to what? I mean, you mentioned the 65,000 acre one and $2 billion cost. So if that's the cost, possibly to do that, what would you compare it to? I mean, would you compare it to not doing the project and save $2 billion? One thing you could do, but then you wouldn't presumably get the benefits.
You could compare it to the distortions that it's going to cause, and what's the values of those distortions compared to the cost. You could also compare it to other alternatives that may reduce the stress that perhaps caused the habitat problem to begin with. I mean,
so in other words, you're not in the second option. You're not changing the goal. You're just saying there's a different way of achieving what you want. If more wildlife is what you want, you say don't do the habitat. Export less water, or whatever it is.
You don't diminish. How can you achieve the goal in the most efficient way without causing an exorbitant amount of distortions to other areas? And I think that's part of what it is. I mean, the Department of Water Resources has in their own manual a benefit cost analysis process that goes through that. And in the same way with water conveyance, if you're talking about spending.
Yeah, I think I wanted to, and you said it, which was that
you keep the goal. You don't compromise the goal.
Right.
No, it's how best can we achieve that?
Okay. Thanks.
I want to go beyond that, because I think the truth, in the end, is that we may not achieve every objective that we'd like to achieve. And the fundamental responsibility that everyone has as a public official is to provide the best information so that you can make informed decisions as we move ahead. So the concept of finding out that information and conveying it in a way so that people understand the trade-offs, understand what you can and can't do, I think is absolutely what we have to do. The challenge is, how do we do that? In the case of trying to impose a requirement on BDCP, which I understand is the import of, at least part of the import of this here, I think that's probably, in the case of the council, beyond our discretion. But I think asking the questions is fundamentally something we...
Doesn't adaptive management mean that you wouldn't be pursuing $2 billion and 65,000 acres blindly?
Yeah, and it means that you start off small, as Dr. Dom has often told us. You start off small, you do the project, you evaluate it, you monitor it, you figure out what is the next step, what do we really want to do.
So isn't that a cost-effective analysis as you go if you're doing that?
I think it is. I think actually costs more up front in some ways, but long-term potentially saves you immense amounts of money because you can actually make those decisions appropriately. So,
Okay.